can say that our estimation in the public sector, what we hear from various stories, and we might have heard different things in the news that have come out over the years about possible ET, alien involvement, things like this with reverse engineering capabilities. So what you're saying is that there very well could be some back engineering going on from non-terrestrial objects at Area 51.
Yes, there is.
Wow.
They exist, whether you want to believe it or not. A lot of us that had access, a lot of the military and civilians and the government employees that had access to those facilities are now ready to come forth because I personally believe there's going to be a disclosure in the very near future. I think it started already regarding the Nimitz incident, the Tic Tac incident. I think there's a lot of things on the horizon regarding disclosure. Whether we're going to get all of it, we probably not. I probably won't get all of it, but we'll get enough to maybe interest the public into pursuing it more aggressively.
Greetings and welcome to the Vortex. I'm your host, Daniel Allen Jones, and I'm here joined by Rick Doty. Rick, it's an honor to be here with you.
It's a pleasure, my pleasure.
So you've been a part of something that's been a pretty controversial topic when we're dealing with the subject of UFOs and government controversy and things like this, but you're here to shed some light on some issues which here at the conference you're going to be unveiling for the first time ever, perhaps, that no one's ever really heard of before. Is that right?
Yes. I'm going to tell some aspects of the Paul Bennewitz story that hasn't ever been told.
That's really incredible because a lot of people have heard something about the case or know a little bit about it from different angles, but I think it's really important to consider all perspectives, and you're here to shed some light on things which otherwise have troubled some people and how they look at the involvement of this figure, Paul Bennewitz, and what's happened to him in regard to the information that he's shared, and it's kind of gone from there. So tell us a little bit how you first got involved and where it went after that.
I was a counterintelligence officer at Kirtland Air Force Base from 1978. In 1978, 1979, I was briefed into a special program. Later that year, Paul Bennewitz had been taking photographs over the Kirtland Air Force Base and Manzano storage area, which is a nuclear weapons storage area on the base. Paul was a patriotic American, thought that what he was photographing might be a threat to the base and to the nuclear weapons, so he reported it to the Air Force. And from that point on, I investigated the incident.
Wow. So this was something that could have potentially been of defense secrecy or enough that it was enough to be looked into from the military point of view.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was what he was gathering, and some of the photographs he was taking were of crafts, some of which we knew, some classified programs that were occurring on the base. But some of the things that he was photographing and some of the signals, the electronic signals he was detecting, we didn't know about. And that's why the Air Force was interested in what he was gathering, how he was gathering it, and from what source it was coming from.
Well, so either way, whether it was something that you guys knew would have been classified or otherwise unknown, these aren't things that the public domain would have been aware of. And so when it came to Paul Bennewitz, he was probably concerned just overall that he wasn't sure if it was terrestrial, perhaps, military, government, or beyond. And so he approached you guys about it, and that became a concern from your standpoint also.
Yes. Paul's background, he was a scientist. He owned a company outside the base. He had a government contract. He had a secret security clearance. He made sensors for submarines and for spacecrafts. Paul had always been interested in the subject of UFO. He was a member of MUFON. He'd had a contact before himself and an observation of a strange craft flying over northern New Mexico with his family. So he had some background in this area. What he was gathering and what he was doing was of great interest to us, to the government. And it was my job to find out what he was doing, whether it might be involving espionage or some other criminal activity, or whether he wanted to steal this technology for his own use. That's why we were interested in it. That's why we conducted an investigation. We did it. It lasted over a period of 5 years. The National Security Agency was also involved in it. And at the end, uh, we knew what we obtained was of interest to the government, and what he was convinced that he was seeing uh, was extraterrestrial related.
So he was more or less, becoming an asset for you guys to acquire intel on from his point of view that helped ascertain what some of these mystery objects may have been. Would that be safe to
Sort of.
say? Or?
Well, we had to convince Paul. Some of the things that he was doing tapped into some highly classified programs. So we had to convince Paul that what he was seeing was actually was extraterrestrial, and not something that we were generating on the base or some high technology, which he actually tapped into. So it was my job just to lead him on. I didn't really have to do much. He was already a full believer in UFOs. Even after this was all over with, I always maintained friendship with Paul. I sat down and told Paul some of the things that he saw was classified, didn't have anything to do with UFOs, but he wouldn't listen to me. He was thoroughly convinced that everything he did, everything he gathered, involved UFOs.
So this is some might seem like as a controversial issue, and I'm sure you've taken a lot of flack over the years, and this is a good opportunity, I think, for you to be up here to share something that I think is really helpful to glean a bit of insight on from your perspective. Whereas a lot of people might say, Doty's, you're sharing disinformation with Paul, and you're telling him that it's this when it's not. But you're saying that that was really to divert him from being aware of actual classified programs. So because in his mind, he was already susceptible to the thought of UFOs and those types of things. So what would your response be to those who they might think that all you're trying to do is be a disinfo agent or something like that, where you're really just trying to convince him that there is something, and later on, like you said, you may have shared otherwise.
Well, everything the government does has a plan, and the plan was generated by somebody other than me. I just had to execute that plan.
Yeah.
And I was told what to do, when to do it, how to do it, and I did. Everything I did was sanctioned by the government. And I just had to convince Paul at that time, because we didn't want him to know about some highly classified projects that were occurring. I just had to convince Paul that what he was seeing was all UFO related.
So was this something that you kind of went out on a limb to talk him into, or were you saying from up above you were specifically told to let him know that these were ET craft or something of that sort?
That's right.
So wow, this is something I think is really kind of interesting. And again, you said you're just following orders through the chain of command, and that's understandable. And it's also a commendable thing because some people can make a diversion and play it out differently. But what I think you're saying here is very important to consider, that the government is coming out and trying to make a statement that may not be necessarily accurate, that those were really extraterrestrial craft, but they're using that line of thinking to employ upon someone who's already susceptible, Paul Bennewitz, for instance, that these things that he saw, even though they were actually classified aircraft or whatever we might be looking at, that they want to use the ET perspective or that concept to reinforce that idea. Do you think that that's something that happens very often, or is this something that maybe only in your instance took place?
No, that happens quite often, unfortunately, in some areas. The government would go above and beyond to convince the public or a segment of the public that what they were seeing was, in fact, UFOs, but what they were really seeing was that some kind of secret space program or aircraft or research development airborne entity that they're testing. And so the government would send in people to convince that particular segment that what they were really seeing was UFOs, So now the UFOs sightings increases in an area. People are convinced that there's UFOs in the area, and it draws their attention away from the classified area.
So that's a really interesting aspect that the military can employ. Would you say it's a matter of defense secrecy?
Yeah, it's absolutely defense secrecy.
So that way we can make sure that, and that's a very important issue. We want to make sure that not, everyone knows what we have, especially foreign countries or those who want to be able to understand what our technology consists of, and then maybe replicate it or however. But to employ a cover story, I think, is an interesting notion. And of course, we probably have this happening in many different ways. Maybe not always just with the idea that it could be extraterrestrial, but that is a fascinating area to really try to dissuade someone from the actual information. So, what was your impression like in interacting with Paul and having to tell him that these were extraterrestrial objects, not tell him the reality that these were classified?
Paul had always believed that Earth was visited from an early age. He was a member of MUFON. He'd done a number of investigations himself of UFOs. He was a pilot. He observed UFOs, he even photographed UFOs while he was flying his plane. So it was not difficult to convince Paul that what he was seeing was, in fact, extraterrestrial. He had everything set up to believe it, and he was thoroughly convinced. He told me beforehand, when I first met him, first interviewed him regarding this, that everything that he was seeing was, in fact, UFO related, ET related. But his concern was it was a danger. These entities or these aliens were hostile, and so there wasn't much I had to do. I would look at his computer screen and I'd say, "Yeah, Paul, that sure looks like a ET craft to me." Or I'd look at a picture that he took, or some kind of electronic signals that he gathered, and said, "Wow, they're not ours." That's all I had to do. He was never bullied. He was never forced to believe anything. He was never. His house was never bugged, at least by us. The National Security Agency might have, but that had nothing to do with me.
Yeah,
or our operation.
Like you said, you're really just following the orders that you received from above, and I'm sure there may have been a degree of reluctance on your behalf to have to lead him down a trail that really was, again, just to maintain defense secrecy. And so, what was it like to be able to confront him, maybe later on at some point, and be able to kind of share a bit more about what he actually was seeing?
Years later, I maintained friendship with Paul right up until he died in 2002. And he called me, his son called me a couple of weeks before he died. I went to his home, or went to the hospital, the hospice center, and I talked to Paul in great length. And this was like 2 weeks before he died. I tried to tell him then that what he was seeing was what he was actually seeing, some of what he was seeing. Now, there's another segment of this, which I'll discuss in my briefing later, but and he just said, Rick, you don't have to tell me that. I know what it was, and you don't have to convince me anything otherwise. And that was the case, and that was his attitude from the very beginning. I didn't have to do anything other than just reinforce his beliefs.
Sure. So what was your driving motive to come later on? He's maybe on the end of his life, and was there something that you felt compelled to do to tell him that, or were you given orders maybe to do that?
No. I wasn't given any orders. I did it personally. I was gone. I left the service in 1988. This was in 2002, and I told him before even I left that I tried to explain it to him. Even the operation ended in 1985. I tried to convince him in 1987. 2 years that was over with. He didn't want to hear me. He said, "No, you don't have to tell me that, because I know what I did. I know what I gathered, and I know it was all ET related." So I tried.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting that you took the time to come back out of your own respect for him, because, like you said, you guys were friends even through all of the things that have happened, I think it's incredible to see you maintain that relationship to some degree, and that you were able to come forward and say, well, they're not really what you thought. And of course, someone who's stuck in that mindset, they're not going to
No.
change for any reason.
He's a very stubborn person. He was convinced of what he saw, what he did was ET related, and nobody was going to change his mind. So it wasn't a difficult operation. I didn't have to employ any dirty tactics or anything like that. I would have never done that in the first place. I know I've had a lot of criticism, people saying, why did you do this? Why did you give him this information? Why didn't you just not do it? Well, you can't just not do something when you take an oath to do something and hold allegiance to the United States government and the job that you're doing. So I had to do what I was told to do. It was a plan, all worked out by headquarters. I read the plan, and all I had to do was initiate the plan. And it was a rather simple plan, and it worked.
Yeah. So shifting gears a bit, I think that's something that a lot of people are probably a bit more relieved to have your perspective on, because it might seem very one-sided, that all you're there to do is just, again, to spread disinfo, which may not really be the case, because you're saying, you're at the event, you're going to be sharing some things that, again, once have never been heard from your side. And I think it's important in any matter to look at both angles, or whatever angles are available. So thank you for sharing that part. Now I'd just like to, again, shift gears. You've been part of the counter intel working for Area 51, if I understand correctly. So what has that been like?
I was a counterintelligence officer at two different times in the 80s at Area 51. It was called the Air Force Flight Test Center, Detachment 3. That's the official name for Area 51.
So let's just say that one more time so we're clear. So
Air Force Flight Test Center.
Air Force Flight Test Center, Detachment 3. Wow, okay.
Which was out of Edwards Air Force Base.
Yeah.
Okay? And Area 51 was a detachment of Groom Lake was a detachment of Edwards. But codename Area 51. Even the employees that worked there called it Area 51.
So that's been a big sort of cloudy, mystical issue, is that they always say, well, Area 51 is the base, when in reality it's the plot of land in Nevada that the base happens to be settled upon. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, back in the 50s, the government took over parts of Nevada, and they referred to it as a Nevada test site. And they tested nuclear weapons above ground and then underground out there, and they surveyed it, and they made it into different areas from area 1 up, and there's some missing areas. But that particular plot of land that Groom Lake is on was classified as Area 51, and that's why people call it Area 51. Now, Area 52, you hear some talk about that. Area 52 is actually the Tonopah Test Range, which is northwest of Area 51.
So it's not like a separate base completely in another place around the world. It's literally a geographical coordinate that correlates in a numerical system that we just call 51, 52, and
yes,
perhaps so on.
Exactly, that's all it is.
So that's kind of an eye-opener for a lot of people. And I'm sure there are many who wonder what the facility is like, what are the levels like. When your involvement was really highly active in this, you're saying in the 80s?
Yes.
What was it like in the basic day-to-day involvement?
Well, Area 51 had a number of underground facilities and above-ground facilities, and it was the area was used almost exclusively to test secret aircrafts, or research and development aircrafts that were being developed by the United States government. The U-2 spy plane was developed out of there. The SR-51 was developed out of there. The F-117 was developed out of there. And they had other exotic crafts that they built. Some of them they'd captured, ET, and some they captured that were of terrestrial origin, such as Soviet MiGs, Chinese MiGs. So they had all these different aircrafts out there. They had different branches, different departments, and they're all compartmented. One didn't know what the other was doing. Reverse engineering of the extraterrestrial crafts that were captured or found were all done at S2 and S4. People call it S4. S2 is actual facility. S4 is an underground section of that facility.
Wow. Okay.
And the area, Papoose Lake is where S2 is located.
This is also a dry lake bed.
It's a dry lake bed.
Yeah.
But in the 1950s and 60s, they used a mining company that was actually doing work over the Nevada test site to drill holes to actually build an underground cavern under Papoose Lake.
Wow.
And that's where the underground facilities are located. There's also underground facilities at the cantonment area of Area 51, Groom Lake, and it's used for research and development.
That's very interesting. I think you just dropped a few bombshells here on us. So we can say that our estimation in the public sector, what we hear from various stories, and we might have heard different things in the news that have come out over the years about possible ET, alien involvement, things like this with reverse engineering capabilities. So what you're saying is that there very well could be some back engineering going on from non-terrestrial objects at Area 51.
Yes, there is.
Wow. So with your time there, there's so much to really delve into with this, but I think to keep it succinct, were you ever privy to any of these operations? Did you ever get to go around on your leisure time, perhaps, and see any of these kinds of things taking place?
Again, everything was compartmented.
Yeah, as it usually is in the government.
Yeah,
and
I had access to certain things, and when I needed access to something for an investigation or an inquiry, I would be given access to one specific area or one specific aspect of that. But there were very few people on that complex that had access to everything.
Yeah.
Even the reverse engineering people, the people, the scientists and technicians that were reversing alien craft into a one that we could fly, they sometimes didn't know what the ET people were doing, and they didn't know, the ET people that were working on the ET craft didn't know what the other people were doing. So that's how compartmented it was, and that's why secrets can be held for a long time, because we might be working in the same office, and I had a clearance for something, you had a clearance for something, and I didn't know what you were doing, you didn't know what I was doing. Now, if I needed to know what you were doing, you might be able, or somebody would give me partial access, and that's the way it was out there. There were some people, I'm sure, that had full access, but I didn't have full access. Even when I was a counterintelligence officer out there, I knew basically what was occurring and where it was occurring, but I didn't know any full details.
Wow,
I didn't need to know it.
Sure, see, that's a big thing. Is if you don't have a need to know, you probably won't know.
That's right.
Wow. Okay. So this is something that a lot of people are seeing now. That we would like to think that if you work at Area 51, even if like you're the camo dudes out at the gate, you must know about all the aliens and everything. When in reality, like you're suggesting, it's all heavily compartmentalized. And so even if you're working in the same area, you might have no idea about what one or the other is doing.
That's right. Exactly right. And and they do that for security reasons.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing because, again, like you said, if everyone knew everything, it would all get out, and it's not just that maybe. And let me hear your thought on this. It may not necessarily be that they don't want the public to know. That could be part of it, but also, again, we don't want our information to get out, maybe to just other countries, and to possible threats. So, do you think it's a deliberate conspiracy to keep the public out of the know just because they don't want them to know, or is it more on the lines of we just don't want our tech to be revealed?
Well, during that time period, our adversary was the Soviet Union, and they were our enemy, so we didn't want them to know what we were doing.
So that was a big priority.
Yeah, so most of it, if not all of it, was dealing in protecting a vital government resource against espionage from an adversary, the Soviet Union. Now, certainly we couldn't give it to the public, because if I gave it to a person who lived maybe 20 miles away, and I explained to them, well, what you were seeing is a real secretive craft. How do I know they're not going to publicize it, or have a friend that could release it to somebody? Because we have an open press in the United States, free press, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so they're going to. If you give something to the press, they're going to publicize it.
Yeah.
And believe me, the Russians, and especially back then, they read our newspapers.
Yeah. Well, this seems to be kind of around the same time frame that we hear this almost sort of legendary character now, Bob Lazar, having an involvement with Area 51. Do any of the experiences that you have maybe confirm or corroborate his account of what he says about S4, the reverse engineering taking place, and the secret weapons testing or aviation tests that maybe had taken place? Does anything that you had happen seem to correlate with that at all?
Yes, there's a number of things that he says, a number of descriptions of entry points into S2 and S4. The only that are correct, and there's some things that are wrong. He refers to S4. Well, S4 is one level of the S2 complex. S2 first, and then level 4. S4 is one level, and that is where the highly classified stuff occurs. I was never down at S4. I was up on top, the S2, the entry area, entry control point into the administrative part of that complex. So the entry that he describes into that area is true. That's exactly how you enter it. As far as S4, I was never down there, so I can't comment on that.
Sure, and that's something I think you could consider. Maybe he deliberately used that term, perhaps, so that he was safe on some cases, but obviously he's spilling the beans on a lot of other things.
That's what I was told. That's probably one of the reasons. And as far as the reverse engineering stuff, I didn't have the technical clearance, so I wouldn't have known any of that. I never had any access to any of that information. So
Yeah.
what he was saying, I can't really comment whether it's right or wrong.
Yeah, and of course he's not even military. He just was a contractor coming in to
Right.
do various operations. So that could be understandable. Now, one of the interesting notions is that it's rumored President Eisenhower was very interested in what was taking place at Area 51 and even threatened as far as to invade it with the Army. Are you privy to any of these kind of ideas that this may have been seen to have almost taken place?
No, way before my time, before I was born, actually.
Sure.
So I know I don't know anything about that, whether that's true or not. I've read it, I've seen it in press, I've seen the YouTube video about it, but no, I wouldn't have known anything about that. I know it was a location that President Kennedy visited, and George Bush, number 2. I think 1 and 2 visited there.
Well, and Clinton also.
Clinton,
he was very interested and even made the statement he wants to reveal what's going on at Area 51. And while a lot of people think that that's kind of silly, some of these presidents actually took a valid interest in what's taking place, and maybe even as far as if these rumors are correct about Eisenhower wanting to go in and figure it out. What are your thoughts on that from maybe a official office point of view? This is something that even at these levels they don't have access to.
I've heard that. I don't know that for a fact. There's certain clearances you have to get to work in the White House. There's certain clearances you have to get to come out. Whenever you hear the word Yankee white, Yankee black, that pertains to presidential clearances or presidential approval. And I know there were a lot of people out in Area 51 that had those clearances. I know Reagan came out. I wasn't there when Reagan came out at Area 51, but I know Reagan came out. I got there a couple of weeks after Reagan came out, and Reagan was supposed to be there for a 30-minute briefing. He landed at Nellis. He was flown out to Area 51 for a 30-minute briefing, and Reagan was there for 6 hours. So you can read a lot into that. I wasn't there, like I said, and I don't know what they briefed him on. Didn't have access to that. But that just tells you right there that President Reagan was intimately involved in the subject matter, and he was very interested in what was going on out there.
That's incredible. So it seems like even from these official standpoints, there is a valid interest. Now there are these speculative theories that perhaps in the very bottom you have these tunnels, these let's say magnetic railways. Some people talk about these different things. Did you ever get any impression or any idea if this was a possibility, going to one facility to another via underground tunnel?
Well, I know there was a underground system from Papoose to Groom Lake, but I don't know of any other. Like I said, I didn't go all the way down to S4, so I don't know what was down there. I know there were entrances that were heavily guarded over at Groom Lake, where they had deep underground elevators going down about 1,000 feet. I was never on them, but I knew they were there. I knew there was 4 of them there. So I don't know where they went. I didn't have any reason or need to know a reason to go down there, but I know they existed.
So there could be something that connects.
Yes,
Who knows?
very good. Yeah, very no, they're very possible. I just didn't have access.
That's very interesting. So in closing, to those out there who think that things like UFOs and secret bases are all silly and imaginative and kind of nonsense, what would you say to them from your point of view and your involvement with these things?
They exist, whether you want to believe it or not. A lot of us that had access, a lot of the military and the civilians and the government employees that had access to those facilities are now ready to come forth, because I personally believe there's going to be a disclosure in the very near future. I think it started already regarding the Nimitz incident, the Tic Tac incident. I think there's a lot of things on the horizon regarding disclosure. Whether we're going to get all of it, we probably not. I probably won't get all of it, but we'll get enough to maybe interest the public into pursuing it more aggressively.
Well, very well said. I'm certainly hoping so. I know a lot of people are. It comes with a lot of courage that you have to be able to do what you're doing here and share some of the things that have been withheld for maybe several years, if not ever having been revealed before. So, Richard, I want to thank you for your time here today. It's been a real honor to be able to have you come forward.
My pleasure.
If you liked this video, be sure to check out our other content and get connected on our page and social media sites. Every day, new discoveries are being made all across the world and beyond, so let's work together to find out what's next. And remember, we won't know if we don't go. I'll see you in the Vortex.